Hello, I'm Bobby Lee. On Thursday, September 28th, I had a chance to sit down with former San Francisco Mayor Frank Jordan to discuss his views on the city. We talked about the rising crime rate, the increasing homelessness problem, and Muni's lackluster on-time performance. Here's the interview in its entirety. How has college students changed since you left college? I know you were a former graduate of USF. How has college students in your mind and college changed?
Well, I think when I was going to college here in San Francisco, it was in some very difficult, tumultuous times. I was a police officer. I was working, and in those days we had an average of about 200 demonstrations a year. Many of them were on college campuses. So to me, we had a lot of unrest because of two big reasons. It was the anti-Vietnam War backlash, and it was also the civil rights movement. And I had the best of both worlds at that time because there was so much activism going on in the universities. I could see it when I was working in the police department, but then I could also understand it better by attending the evening classes at the University of San Francisco. Much more activism, I think. Now, I think since we don't have that kind of a complicated lifestyle, even though it's not looking good in terms of what's happening in the Middle East now, we didn't have the same kind of unrest. We don't have it, at least yet, that I can see. And I think the young students now are really focused on looking at where their future lies. They're dedicated to getting a good education. I think they're looking to go on to higher education more now, too. The competition is getting more difficult. The technology, the science is just moving so rapidly, the communications, that they're not just looking for four-year degrees. They're looking for masters and doctorates to compete in this very difficult competitive world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to switch gears and talk about your views on the city today. As a former police chief, you were pretty familiar with a lot of the crime that was going on back then. How does that compare to today? Is San Francisco safer since you were from the time since you were police chief?
You know, that comes and goes in different cycles. I put a great deal of emphasis on public safety. That was because of my background, obviously, as spending 33 years in criminal justice and 6 years as chief of police. I was fortunate, though, because in my day I had spent maybe 10 years prior to becoming chief of police in community involvement, citizens' participation. We literally had a Project Safe, which is still going in the police department, but not anywhere near to the degree that it was in my time. We literally had 3,000 neighborhood block clubs in different parts of the city, everywhere, every neighborhood. And the whole idea was to get people familiar with the police department. If we had a meeting in a neighborhood, say between 7 and 9 o'clock, just like we had tonight here, I would make sure that the officer who would respond, if they had an emergency in that home, would respond during that meeting. So then the neighbors who would be sitting there could hear that this is Officer Jones and Mary Smith, who would normally respond in an emergency, and here's what we see based on our experience every day in the police department as the problems in your neighborhood. So it opened up lines of communication. It diffused some of the feelings about them versus us. And it also, what's the proper reporting procedures? And if there was a burglary list going on in the neighborhood, well, then all the neighbors would be looking out for each other. They had something tangible to work with. But it broke down a lot of the barriers, and I think that somehow has to be brought back. And some of it is what I discussed tonight. There's such a shortage of police officers, 250 down. It's hard to get that kind of a relationship where you can have them all drop into community meetings in the evening. But it sure worked for me. And I think it kept me in good stead with the neighborhoods even when I was mayor, because they knew I had been out there working with them in the past in public safety issues.
Mm-hmm. So do you see the murder rate, which is, we've had a lot of murders so far this year. How do you see Mayor Gavin Newsom having to approach the issue to really bring the murder rate under control?
I give him high marks for what he is attempting. I think he is going above and beyond by going out to some of the high crime areas personally himself at nighttime, going out and dealing with some of the the teenagers who are dealing with the violence and the drugs and the gang-related issues. He's looking at opening up not only lines of communication, but how can we find some way to get others to help him with this issue. I mentioned in my speech tonight, though, one of the problems, based on my own experience in law enforcement, is that homicides, sometimes they go high, sometimes they go low. You can only really be personally involved in something like maybe 20 to 25% of those homicides. If there's 100 homicides, maybe 25 might be something you could do something about through a uniform, visible presence out on the streets. The other 75% might be happening through the heat of passion, spontaneity of a fight that breaks out and somebody's killed before the police even have a chance to arrive on the scene or even be there. Many of them happen indoors, in businesses and private residences, and you're called after the incident is already completed. So he shouldn't be held accountable so much for every homicide that goes on, but he is doing the part that makes sense to me, and that is the gang-related ones, the street crimes, the narcotic issues. Start saturating in those areas where you see the crimes becoming the most vicious and where they wind up with homicides. He's also taking a bold move with the cameras in the neighborhoods. I think in my day that would have been unacceptable. I think there would have not been enough trust or credibility where we could have an eye in the camera looking to a police station and every activity we had in our neighborhood. There would be resentment to it in my time. Now I believe the timing is right where they're ready for it and they're asking, the neighborhoods in the high crime areas are asking for the cameras. I think that will help because when you have witness protection programs and witness relocation programs, but people are afraid to use them because of reprisals and fear factors, that you have to have some other tool to use. When you have a camera, you have the actual suspect in the picture, so you have something to start with when you're doing an investigation.